Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. I'm Aisha, your host. Why do Muslims only eat foods that are considered halal? What significance does it have in the life of a Muslim? And what about other religions such as Christianity and Judaism? Do they also have specific requirements for food? Let's get Dr. Shabir Ally's thoughts on exploring food in the halal way. Welcome to the show, Dr. Shabir.
Pleasure to be on.
So we're exploring a topic today that I think we do get a lot of comments on YouTube about, which is, exploring the idea of halal food. So what is halal by definition?
By definition, most things are halal. It means, basically halal in Arabic means permissible.
Mm-hmm.
And the Quran declares that Muslims are to eat the things which are good and pure. So that is wide open. The items from the sea, there are different opinions among Muslim scholars, but the one most widely accepted is based on a verse of the Quran from the 5th chapter that says that God has given you permission to eat anything from the sea. The Sayd al-Bahr is the way it is designated. And so some others say it's only fish that is allowed, but many scholars say it's anything from the sea, basically. Now, the fact that something is declared to be permissible does not mean that all Muslims will like it. Some Muslims may not like certain things and prefer not to eat them, but basically the permission is there. If somebody wants to eat it, it's allowable. Now, when it comes to land animals, there are 4 things which are declared in the Quran to be unclean or impure or haram. That's the title that's used in the Quran. Haram meaning that it is prohibited. And the Quran mentions them as the maita, which is a broad category for things which are already found to be dead, as opposed to that which you deliberately slaughter for food. So that plus the meat of strangled animals or, strangled animals will come on the maita because they're already found strangled. Then the blood, so if blood is flowed out of the animal, that blood is rendered impermissible.
So the blood itself? The
blood itself, yes. The meat of pigs or swine. And lastly, that which is dedicated to other than God. So if one were to dedicate meat to a certain altar in praise of some idol, then that would be impermissible for Muslims.
So just a question, because I know we've gotten this question before. When we talk about swine specifically, does that mean if Muslims consider that to be haram and we don't eat it, does that mean that that's considered like Muslims don't respect pigs?
No, it doesn't mean that Muslims should disrespect pigs or hold them in contempt. It just means that for some reason the Creator decided not to allow us to eat pigs, and it could be for health reasons. Maybe in the past the people did not have the cooling facilities and the cooking facilities to cook the meat at high temperatures to get rid of all germs and bacteria. It could be that the nature of the pig seems to be like what human beings normally despise anyhow. It's like if we say to somebody, you're piggish. So the sense of connection with what we eat is there, and perhaps to keep that distance and to keep one's self-esteem and purity of thought for these reasons, both in the Bible and now in the Quran, the meat of swine is declared to be impermissible.
Do we have any rationale for trying to understand what the rationale behind this idea of eating halal? And you also talked about, we can't eat things that are not sacrificed for other than God. So a little bit on that.
Yes, if the monotheism or the belief in one God is very strong in Islam. It's emphasized very strictly. So if an animal is dedicated to other than God, then this is a way of honoring and worshiping another God. And for Muslims, this is taboo. We can't worship another God. We can't even get close to that. In fact, this was already known from the Bible. It is interesting that St. Paul, in his letter to the Corinthians, says in the first letter that you can eat anything that is sold in the marketplace, even the meat which is sacrificed to idols, because you know that idols are nothing. But in putting the matter this way, St. Paul was actually taking a different line of interpretation than was taken by the original disciples of Jesus, some of them who insisted on the maintenance of the Jewish kosher laws, which would have meant that you cannot eat something that is sacrificed to the idols. So this is a known ancient custom and religious rite. It is maintained also in the Quran.
And it's clear that it's also valid in Christianity and Judaism, but maybe not. Is it still as followed religiously by other groups? Or because I know Muslims, we follow it very rigidly, but what about other faith groups?
Yeah, just to be clear, Christians generally do not abide by this, by the Jewish kosher
Yes,
laws, following from the interpretations of St. Paul, though early Christians are known to have done that. For example, Peter was able to say, as mentioned in Acts of the Apostles, nothing impure or unclean has ever entered my mouth. And some interpret the story within which that speech was made to mean that now things are declared to be allowable for eating, regardless of their origins or kind. But the best interpretation of that passage is that Peter was being shown in a dream, not that he can now eat the things which Jews normally considered impure, but now that Peter can associate with Gentiles, whom the Jews at the time considered to be off limits when it comes to sharing a meal together, or close association with the Gentiles were thought to be taboo for some of the Jewish Puritans, those who were referred to as Pharisees at the time. So now, more broadly, as you're asking about the world's major religions, I have not investigated all of the religions on this matter, but from my cursory reading about the world's religions, I did not find that the religions have very strict rules, as we find in Judaism, and then to a lesser extent in the religion of Islam.
Now, just going back to a little bit on the history in Islamic traditions, did the idea and concept of eating halal, was that how it was back in the day and it's still preserved the same way, or has it evolved over the years?
In the Islamic tradition, there have been different interpretations, and the different interpretations obviously have evolved to a greater or lesser extent. But there are two interpretations that one needs to be aware of when it comes to the idea of meat that is offered to other than God. So suppose a person of another religion slaughters meat mentioning the name of a God other than Allah. And now we have to be careful here, because for Jews there is only one God, and if they were to mention the name, even if they use a different name, they're still referring to Allah. But let's say someone who doesn't, a very different religion that has a God which is very difficult to identify with the Muslim concept of one God, then the mention of the name of that other God on the meat would render the meat impermissible for Muslims. But the counter to that, or the flip side of that, is that Muslims, upon slaughtering meat for their own consumption, would generally say Bismillah in the name of God. Bismillah, Allahu Akbar, in the name of God, and God is the greatest. Now, the question that arose among Muslims is whether the mention of the name of God is an absolute requirement to make the meat permissible. We know that if another name is mentioned, the meat is impermissible. But if another name is not mentioned, is the meat permissible, basically, or is it permissible only when you mention the name of God over it at the time of slaughtering? Among these major schools of Islamic jurisprudence, the Shafi'i school held that mentioning the name at the time of slaughtering is a sunnah. It is a traditional practice of Muslims going all the way back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but it is not an absolute requirement, meaning that if you were to omit it, the meat is still basically pure. Not that you should omit it, but if you happen to omit it, it's still pure.
So if you omit the whole saying, or just?
If you omit the saying, if you did not mention the name of God, because it's not the mention of the name of God that makes the meat pure, it is the fact that it does not fall into the haram category, the impermissible category. And what would make it fall into the impermissible category, for our purposes here, it is the stipulation that if it had been dedicated to a God other than Allah. So you have three scenarios. It's dedicated to Allah, it's dedicated to another God apart from Allah, or it's not dedicated to anyone at all. So on the Shafi'i principle, if it's not dedicated to anyone at all, then it's basically permissible.
Okay.
But the Hanafi school, on the other hand, which is well known in the Indo-Pak subcontinent, in Guyana, where I was born and where I grew up and where we first learned about Islam, it is thought that the mention of the name of God is what makes it permissible. And that interpretation, actually both interpretations are linked to the 6th chapter of the Quran, the 121st verse, which says, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا مِمَّا لَمْ يُذْكَرِ اسْمُ اللَّهِ عَلَيْهِ وَإِنَّهُ لَفِسْقٌ. So it can be translated two different ways. The first part of it is the translation is easy and agreed upon. Do not eat that on which the name of God has not been mentioned. But the last part now becomes tricky because one translation would say, while it is fisk, while it is impure. And another translation would say, for that would be impure.
Okay.
So on the Shafi'i interpretation, it is meat that is already impure because it was offered to other than God that is being spoken about here. So don't eat this meat, not because the name of God hasn't been mentioned on it, but precisely because it has been dedicated to other than God.
Yeah.
Whereas on the Hanafi interpretation, do not eat this meat because the name of God has not been mentioned on it and therefore it is impure. So these two interpretations prevail among Muslim societies to this day. And this leads often to a puzzle among Muslims because you may have somebody from the Indo-Pak subcontinent following the Hanafi school. You may have someone from one of the Arab countries following the Shafi'i school. And they meet together and one can order meat from the local restaurant and say that, well, so long as this is not pork, this is meat from the people of the book, the Halal Kitab, from either Jews or Christians, and therefore it is generally permissible for Muslims. And the Muslim from the Indo-Pak subcontinent finds this shocking, revolting. How can you eat the meat which is haram, basically, to them? So two different interpretations that we should be aware of.
What about the other two? You mentioned four, the schools of thought. Are there any other perspectives on this, or are these two the most
I think
prevailing?
these are the two that can be seen to be in contrast with each other. The others may have some variations on this, but these are the two principal positions taken with regards to this. Now, I mentioned food of the people of the book. There is a verse in the Quran, the 5th chapter, and the 3rd verse, which says that the food of the people of the book is permissible for you. So what does that mean, basically? On some interpretations, it means that whatever Jews and Christians can eat, and that is allowable in their religions, it's not as simple as that, but let me just keep it at that level. Then basically that would be permissible for Muslims as well. Now, we should ask, why then is the food of the people of the book permissible for Muslims? Well, one answer seems to be very clear, that the Jews and Christians do not believe in another God. They basically believe
monotheistic.
in the monotheistic belief, even though Muslims may have questions about the Christian belief in the Trinity and in Jesus' divinity. The problem is alleviated because Christians do not slaughter in using any name. They just simply slaughter. Jews generally also do not mention a name, but in one tradition, in my humble research, I found that there is a mention, but they don't actually mention the name, because in Jewish traditions, there have been a reluctance to mention the name of God. So instead of the name of God, one would say Adonai, the Lord, or in the tradition regarding slaughtering that I stumbled upon, they would say Hashem, the name. So instead of saying the actual name, they would say the name.
It in some way,
Yes. So using a kind of a circumlocution going around the name itself, so to avoid mentioning it. So in that case, the meat slaughtered by the people of the book, the Jews and Christians in particular, is clearly permissible for Muslims because they do not dedicate this meat to any other than God, which is the thing that would make it impermissible on the Shafi'i principle. And it seems to me that that interpretation is the more comprehensive one. It explains why the food of the people of the book is permissible for Muslims, because now if you take the Hanafi interpretation, which says that it's impermissible if the name of God has not been mentioned, now the question is, then why would the food of the people of the book be permissible for us? Would God make an exception? First of all, restrict you. You have to say the name of God in order to make your meat permissible. But if you get it from Jews and Christians and the name of God is not mentioned, well, then it's still permissible for you. It wouldn't make sense. Now, the Hanafi answer to that would be, the Jews and Christians at the time when the Quran was revealed must have been mentioning the name of God. But we can find no evidence of any such tradition. Sometimes it is thought as well that Christians at the time probably did not have the beliefs which Muslims find objectionable today, like beliefs in Trinity, belief in Jesus' divinity.
Yeah.
But as far as we can trace back, the Quran itself is evidence that Christians at the time had the sorts of beliefs that is evident now among Christians.
Do we know in the time of the Prophet, because you mentioned the Sunnah is that, you know, the Prophet used to sacrifice and say the name. Do we have any instances dating that far back where there was exception that the Prophet himself also encountered? This idea of, you know, people of the book and eating that food, like any exceptions that we're aware of?
Yes, it is mentioned in the hadith that some wheat was brought to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and somebody said, well, you know, this came from a people and we don't know if they mentioned the name of God or not. And he said, well, just say Bismillah and eat it at the time. So in that way, the name of God is still mentioned over the food before you actually eat it. So in a way that satisfies the requirement of saying the name of God if somebody felt that this is an absolute requirement.
Okay, well, I think, sorry, I thought there was more to that, but that's I think it gives us a good holistic picture. Obviously a complex topic, and maybe we'll come back to it another time. Thank you very much, Dr.
You're
Shabir.
welcome.
Hey YouTube, we hope you benefited from this video. If you liked it, or if you didn't, let us know in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more, check out some of our other videos. And don't forget to subscribe so you can get new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday.